Tonight, on this edition of The Small Interview, our guest is award-winning RVTV producer, John Letz. Hello and welcome to The Small Interview with Glamour Dave. I'm your host, David Glamour Dave Nienow, and today we are doing a special emergency production of The Small Interview because this time slot that we're producing this happens to have been used by another producer who canceled on the slot, and we've got to fill the space here at the studio, and so my show is the absolute quickest show to get in action right away.
Yeah.
And so today I have the honor of having John Letz on the show again. John is a fellow producer at RVTV. I just interviewed him just like a week or so ago. And so we're going to continue talking to John about his radio career, which we just barely got into in the last interview. And then we'll continue with the interview for the next show after this, and we'll be talking to John about his work here at RVTV and his education shows that he programs and hosts. And so, John, I welcome you to the show once again.
Well, thank you, Dave. It's very glad to be here. I'm very glad to be here. And yeah, we started with my talking about we're going to do this JPR show.
Yeah, right.
On their new about their new studios, which will be coming up pretty soon.
Yeah.
I'm still working on some of the editing. But it reminded me of my radio career,
Yes.
being in that beautiful radio station that they have. And we saw some pictures earlier in the previous show. Not all radio studios are beautiful.
Yeah.
Some of them are kind of grimy.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
But you're going to see, I told this story, and I'll kind of back up a little bit, because this is how John Letz from Crowley, Louisiana, a town of 14,000 farmers and mill workers in the rice mills, ended up in Detroit, Michigan, in the 5th largest market at that size in radio, in top 40 radio. And so it started when I was still in high school, which I got my first job when I was 16, still in high school. And I used to listen to, at night, WLS in Chicago.
Okay.
They're 50,000 watts, and at night that wave skips over the atmosphere and goes all over the place. So there were times I could hear WLS as clearly as I could hear WWL in New Orleans, down in Louisiana. And I really like this disc jockey named Bill Bailey.
Right.
He just became my role model. And so I told you the last time about how I started calling him on the phone.
Yes.
What I didn't emphasize is from time to time after that, he would say, "Why don't you send me an air check?" which is a little part of what you sound like on the air.
Right.
And over time, I got this feedback from him. I also got feedback from a radio programmer named Al Casey, who had worked at that station in Lake Charles, Louisiana.
Okay.
And it was funny because I had gotten passed over for a promotion. I had been doing the graveyard shift, okay, midnight to 6, fighting to stay awake sometimes. And they hired, someone left, and I thought, well, they're going to move me to 6 to midnight. No, they hired someone else. And I was not very happy about it. Sent this air check to Al Casey, and he sent back a letter to the program director and said, "You better hang on to this guy as long as you can, because he's heading to a major market." Talk about a shot in the arm.
Yeah, right.
So that and this feedback from Bill Bailey, by that time Bill Bailey had gone to Detroit, WDRQ in Detroit. And so I'd contact him after he was there, and again, he asked me for air checks. So here I was in Huntsville, Alabama. I was lonely as could be, because there I was at Christmas. I couldn't go back to Louisiana for Christmas. I was kind of lonely, kind of feeling down, and I get this phone call. It's Bill Bailey. He says, "Well, how would you like to come up to Detroit? I didn't even think a nanosecond. I mean, there was no hesitation.
Yeah.
When do you want me there?
Right.
So he gave whatever notice I could, packed up everything in my little Chevy Vega. This is January,
Yeah,
okay, so
yeah.
I passed through Christmas. I survived just fine knowing I was going to Detroit.
Yeah.
Drove up to Detroit. Remember, it's January. I'm getting there. I'm on this freeway, and it was wet, and this black water came up on my windshield. So it's very hard to see.
Yeah.
Well, down south, we always just put water in the windshield washer, you know, the little
Yeah.
tank. Well, that was frozen solid. You know? The other thing is, I got there. Well, I got there at night, and Bill Bailey and one of the other disc jockeys came down to greet me and everything. And one of the disc jockeys, he went by the name China Jones. He looks at me. He's also from Louisiana, by the way. He looks at me and says, "You're going to need a coat up here." And I had this little thin, unlined denim jacket. And I said, "Well, I'm wearing a coat." He says, "No. You need a real coat." So I eventually got one. And I look like an Eskimo. I mean, it's, you know, and that's what people up there wear in the winter.
Right.
It's very cold.
Yeah.
So anyway, I started working for Bill Bailey. Again, I was on the late night, but it was 2 in the morning till 6 because the shifts were shorter. And so, did we see Bill Bailey? I haven't looked at the monitor, so if you could flash him up again, I'll tell you a few things about it. So there's Bill Bailey.
Yeah. Okay.
I never knew what he looked like, but he has a voice like he's God's spokesman. I mean, he's got really great pipes, you know.
Yeah. Okay.
And if we look at the next one, we'll see one of the things that really impressed me. Notice how the equipment is way beyond what I'd worked with in the small market. Now this control board is by Gates, and it's called an executive for those of you who like to know about such things. And there's, I mentioned the last time, each of those knobs is a potentiometer, which we just call a pot. So you turn the pot up or you turn the pot down. There's my COS headphones, which I always got those open ear headphones because they sounded really good. Now, you see the phone over on the edge, and you see the little speaker.
Right. Yeah.
Well, what we figured out was that if you removed a certain part from the phone, you could press more than one line down at a time. And one of the things we used to do to amuse, 2 to 6 in the morning, Dave, okay? What we would do to amuse ourselves is we would push 2 or 3 of those lines at the same time and not say anything. So you'd hear someone saying, "Is this WDRQ? What do you mean? I'm calling WDRQ. Get off the phone, I'm calling WDRQ." You know? So sometimes they would fight, but other times they became friends. And we would kind of follow up, you know, we kind of follow up on those friends, and some of them stayed friends for years and years with that.
That's funny.
So I did that 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. And it was a nice time to be on because it was quiet. There weren't many commercials that time of morning, and I could play long versions of things, you know, Stairway to Heaven almost every night.
Yeah,
you
right.
know? And so I got along very well with Bill Bailey as an employee, you know, part of his team, and there were some changes at the station over the 1 year I was there. And one of them was that he was removed. He was fired.
Oh, okay.
First, he was replaced as program director, and he continued doing the morning show. And, well, he was fired or he quit. It's kind of hard to tell sometimes. Kind of like the White House. You know,
Yeah, right.
Kind of hard to tell. So, but anyway, he showed up in Cleveland. Well, I had done the last quarter, and every quarter in a major market, every one of those quarters is surveyed. You know, that's the meat and potatoes, you know, the survey that sells spots that way. Well, we did what we called the book for that season. And I think that would have been the fall book. And the new program director decided that I had to go. So he explained that he didn't think that I was getting the kind of ratings that we needed to get. And so it was better for me to leave the station. You know how it is.
Yeah,
when-
right.
They never just say, you're fired, like
Yeah.
some people. So anyway, that book later came out, the ratings, and I actually had the highest ratings that he had ever had
Yeah.
on the all-night show. But it was too late
Yeah.
because I got offered a gig by Bill Bailey over at WIXY in Cleveland. Now, it's interesting. I just went online to kind of research these stations that I used to work at. They're now calling themselves what they called themselves in the 60s. They called themselves WIXY. 1260 was their dial number, AM. So 1260 WIXY. Well, when I went to work there, they were trying to not sound too teeny bopper. So we were told, you will never say WIXY. This is WIXY. And you're not to say 1260 at all, because they're already on 1260 if they're listening, you know. So it's kind of interesting that they kind of went full circle.
Yeah, right.
The last show I did on there, they had changed the format from top 40 to some kind of adult contemporary format, but it was not well done, I can tell you that. And they let me do mornings. And you know, in radio, doing the morning show is like the gold ring. It's like, you know, I did terrible. I mean, I can look back now. I had no idea how to do a morning show. You know, you're supposed to be joking, and I joked a lot, but I was a time and temp jock. I did my magic over the musical intros of songs and when the song was fading out. That's where I worked. That's where whatever message I did was over that. I wasn't used to all this time of talking about this and that, you know. So I really didn't do a very good job of that. Bill Bailey, he was still there when I left. He was the program director, but he wasn't the morning guy. And so I should back up a little bit, just in talk. I saw the picture of us in basketball uniforms. When we were in Detroit, we had a team called the Q Ballers. Because we were the Q, the super Q. You know, we were part of that format. And we played basketball. I, from infancy, was never very coordinated, so I didn't play very good basketball, but they would put me out there because I was one of the disc jockeys. And we had this kid who would come in during parts of the day. They would have people come in and answer the phones and keep data as to which songs were being requested. And that was his main job. It was just a part-time job. Well, he also coached our basketball team because he was real good at it. To me, it's like no one gave him much credit. You know, he wasn't a disc jockey. He didn't have a public name. He wasn't one of the rounders that they got into the game to win the games. And so I just decided I would go down and get him a plaque. And so in that picture, you see me and one of the other disc jockeys handing him that plaque. Just as recognition for being our coach. You know? So I thought that was really neat. Let's see whatever picture was after that, and then I can tell you whether we're okay. So that's the picture I'm talking about. That's George receiving the plaque. The guy with the red-head beard was Tom Smith, and I worked with him. He was another one that Bill Bailey brought into these major markets. So we worked together several times. And then if you look at the next one, what you'll see is we talked about reel-to-reel tape recorders. This is a Scully, and at the time it was believed to be better than the old Ampexes. And of course this was stereo, so you see two of the electronics there at the top. And if you look carefully, you will see that splicing block I told you about. You see the heads of the tape recorder? Right on top of there is mounted. It's a little piece of metal with a groove in the middle. And we would actually get a razor blade and cut the tape and then cut it again and then put it together with splicing tape, you know, where we wanted it. And then, of course, the turntables. You know, most of our music for production was on turntable, but for the playlist, it was all on these cartridges that we talked about last time. Let's see the next one. And you'll see, I was the public service director. So if you woke me up at the right time, I would go to these events, these community events. And this was a Clean Up Detroit event. And so that's the van that we would drive around. We had these bumper stickers. And certain times we would drive around, we'd take turns driving around. And if we saw a bumper sticker on a car, if it was the right time of day, we would call it in. There was actually a mobile phone in there. And we would call it into the station, and they would go on, and we would describe the car that had the sticker on and say, look in your rear view mirror. I have $50 for you or $100 for you. And so they would, most of the time they would pull over, and we had the money right there, you know. So we'd go, here's $100. I had people cry over getting $100, you know.
That actually, I remember radio stations here locally doing that when I was a kid.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's been like forever since the last time I've ever seen that kind of thing being done around here. But it used to be done by a couple of stations around here when I was like a teenager.
What I learned in doing that was do not go to the upper crust neighborhoods because they didn't need $100 and they didn't care. They really, the time was more valuable to them. I can remember almost crashing the van trying to catch up to a Mercedes-Benz that was trying to get away from me because they didn't want to be bothered with it, you know. I tell you, if I went into the ghetto and I had $100, they didn't try to get away from me. They wanted to stay there. Let's see the next one there. Oh, that's, you see what I look like with a beard. This is the control board at WIXY, so now we're in Cleveland. It was homemade. They had engineers all over the place. It was a union shop. I was in the union, and the engineers were in a different union. And it's one of the few stations we didn't have a remote control with the transmitter, because out at the transmitter shack, they had people on duty all the time. They'd call up, they got so bored, they'd call up and say, hey, you want us to run an air check for you? Because we're just sitting here. You know? So, yeah, sure, run an air check for me. So they did. And then if you look at this next one, this is, again, is manufactured. So when I left Cleveland, when I had that disastrous morning show, okay, I went back to Louisiana, helped my dad build a house. So I got to spend some quality time, you know, back in my hometown. Had a blast, you know, with people from high school and stuff like that. Well, after a while, I got another call from Bill Bailey, and he said, hey, I'm in St. Louis now. You want to come up? I didn't have to think much about it. I mean, you know, I was kind of dying to get back into radio. Well, that's the same kind of control board we saw before. That's just that it was the same media group, you know, that owned those Q stations. This was KSLQ. Now, WDRQ in Detroit, if you're way over here on the West Coast, you may not be aware of this. Everything east of the Mississippi starts with a W. Everything west of the Mississippi starts with a K. And in the case of St. Louis, we're right on the west bank of the Mississippi River. So it was KSLQ. So same company, and Bill Bailey was the one who hired me. He hired Tom Smith again a little bit later. And this was really the last of my enthusiastic time, I would say, in major market radio. I learned to pass the daytime doing things like riding my bike through, there's a park there called Forest Park. And it's one of those places where these cities used to have a World's Fair, you know, back in 1910 or something like that. And they've preserved the space with all these things. So I would be out in nature, you know. I was really discovering my love for nature just in that park and other areas around there. And you know, then at night I would go in and do my show. Eventually I ended up going up to 10 at night till 2 in the morning at one point before I left. And then let's see this next slide. And what you'll see is also at KSLQ. Now, you see the same control board, but what I'm mentioning is some of this equipment on top of it. We had a really nice production room. We had a harmonic synthesizer and some other equipment where you could speak into a microphone and it would come out like a chipmunk, or it would come out like, you know, real, you know, spacey kind of stuff. And so I just loved that control room. And this was the only station I worked at that had 2 production rooms. So if you go to the next slide, this is, oh, okay, we skipped, I apparently didn't put that slide in. But there's another production room. Okay, so there it is. No, there it is. Okay, so no, that's the control room. So it's that I didn't put it in. It's not anyone's fault. Don't feel bad, anybody. So we'll get to this picture in a moment. But in St. Louis, let's see if there's anything. Well, just being on the Mississippi was kind of cool.
Yeah.
And they had all these places you could go. You could go on a riverboat, you know, and all that. Well, I worked there for a year, and I did a lot of experimenting. And some of it turned out really great. I had a blast doing it. Some of it I listen to now and I go, what was I thinking? You know, so you kind of get it both ways.
Yeah.
But by that time, I'm kind of starting to think, you know, maybe I want to do something else in life.
Yeah.
The thing about working in radio is that even today, you work 6 days a week. It's just expected. You work 6 days a week. And it's not that I minded doing the radio work, but it's like, well, I want to do something else too.
Yeah.
You know, and not just have one day off.
Yeah.
You know, so let's, the picture you just saw was, if you could flash it up again, going from all that control board with all those pots and all that stuff, this is WKYS in Washington, D.C. It's the last major market station I worked at. This is the only thing that's in front of me, and really, there's a few buttons there, but really the only thing there is to cut your microphone off so you can cough. It's called a cough switch. And one of those knobs to turn up the volume on your headphones, and the other to turn up the speaker. Go to the next one and I'll explain. A guy on the other side had all the equipment. They were the engineers. So it was an NBC owned and operated station. NBC was owned by RCA, so that control board is an RCA control board. And that fellow Roy was the engineer I usually had, although sometimes someone else would be there.
Yeah.
But I never touched any of that. All I had was what you saw before.
Yeah.
And that felt really weird.
I imagine, yeah.
Now this is the second time when I didn't have a control board. To back up a little bit, after I had gotten released from the station in Detroit, there were a couple of months when I was unemployed. And I was putting out tapes all over the place to try to get a job. And I got a call from WCFL in Chicago. They were WLS's main competition. And they invited me over for a job interview. So it was just for part-time, but I thought it's better than unemployment.
Yeah, right.
So I went over there, and they told me from the beginning, this is owned by the Chicago Federation of Labor. That's the CFL in there. So I went there, and they said, we want you to go on the air for 1 hour. Top 40 thing, you're familiar with it, but you don't get to touch the equipment. So you just have to signal to the engineer when you want your mic on, when you want it off. They'll do everything else. It felt really weird to not have that control, you know. And but it ended up being the shortest job I ever had. I was on the air for exactly 1 hour. Went back home to Detroit. This guy wouldn't call me. The program wouldn't call me and wouldn't call me, wouldn't return my phone calls. Finally, he calls back and says, I'm sorry I didn't respond earlier, but we're changing format. We're changing to a beautiful music format. Think slow, you know. And he said, we're not going to let anyone go. The person we were going to let go, we're letting them keep their jobs as long as they want them, you know, during this change. So that was my 1 hour. That was the shortest job I ever had for 1 hour, and I don't think I ever got paid for it.
Oh, geez.
I didn't push it. And, you know, then I went to Cleveland. And so this station in Washington, D.C., the thing was, I was a big John Denver fan. Even though we didn't play a whole lot of it, I was a big John Denver fan. And what I really liked along the lines of John Denver was his whole connection with nature. And then that part of me was really waking up. So during the day, again, you find me in the park. You don't find me in the disco or anything like that. You find me in the park. So I'd hang out in Rock Creek Park. And then when I would go on the air, and that was a 7 to midnight gig, everyone else, in that kind of station is talking about, well, party and dress up and dance and all this other kind of stuff. And I'm going, oh man, the trees, you should see the leaves in the park, and I'm going to be hugging trees tomorrow. And finally, Bill Bailey, we were very good friends. There were times he invited me over for Thanksgiving, and we were more than just the employee, boss. And he called me in his office and he said, John, this is a disco station, and people, live to go out, dress up and go out to the disco and dance. They don't really hug a whole lot of trees. And he says, I think you'd just be a lot happier if you were doing something else.
Yeah.
So my last interaction with Bill Bailey was we hugged.
Yeah. Well,
and then I went my way.
yeah.
And he went his way, and after that, I came to Oregon.
Yeah.
And I had come to Oregon. I decided I was going to write a book. And what I didn't write a book. I wrote a manuscript.
Uh-huh.
And it never got even close to publishing, thank heavens, because it was really bad. I mean, I really wasn't that good of a writer, but I just wanted to do it.
Yeah.
And I had come out and lived in Creswell for a while, kind of outside in the country in Creswell. Fell more in love with nature and very much in love with Oregon. Yeah. And then when I had a chance, I came back here. So footnote, sadly, while I did get in touch later with, I kind of lost touch with all those people. I got in touch with Tom Smith and with Bill Bailey. Tom Smith let me know how to get in touch with Bill Bailey. He was working in Grand Rapids, Michigan at a public radio station that played oldies. And so I got in touch with him. Not long after that, he passed away. He was doing a celebrity golf tournament, and he had a heart attack right there. And within 6 months, the same thing happened to Tom.
Yeah.
So I stopped calling anyone that I worked with. I will not call people that I worked with. But I tell you, that whole part of my life, really, between those two people, Bill Bailey and Tom Smith, it was just a wonderful and very fun time of my life.
Yeah. Well, John, I very much appreciate hearing your stories in old radio. It's definitely directed you to where you're at now. And,
it does,
and so we're going to continue on with the interview. And so the next show that follows this is I'm going to continue to talk to John, and he's going to talk about his life here in Oregon and what brought him to RVTV and the creation of his education programs that he does here at the studio. So that will be next. So look for that next show. And I thank my crew, the small crew that we have for this, for continuing to stay around to help with this production.
Our heroes.
Yeah, that's right. And so we will see you next time on the Small Interview. And that's it for this edition of the Small Interview for tonight. We're always eager to hear what you have to say, so follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, and support this show at our Patreon page at patreon.com/Glamour Dave. You can send us your comments to viewer@glamourdave.com.